So much for joining us today. Guillermo, si nos ayudas con la presentación. He's gonna present your presentation in just a second. Your mic is off. You need to turn it on.
Turn on your mic, please.
Can you hear me now, Ken?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to speak. So I'm aware I'm the only one speaking, presenting in English today. So I hope I can live up to the expectation. But thanks for inviting me. As Ken has already said, I will focus on the LNG trend in Latin America between like this year compared to last year and previous years. So this is basically a snapshot of what I'll be talking on: LNG demand, new LNG demand in the regions. I will try to focus a bit on Brazil, and in terms of supply, also within the region, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, and then the US, and just a bit of something I thought would be interesting on new trade routes that are emerging out of the region. So LNG demand last year in Latin America as a whole fell, and that was mainly due to the coronavirus pandemic, as countries in the region, like most of the rest of the world, went into lockdowns, which crushed energy demand, which led to lower LNG imports. Imports have now been recovering this year as countries in the region, again, like the rest of the world, are emerging out of lockdowns. But particularly those imports have been driven particularly by Brazil and Argentina, which I will touch on the next slide. And here, this graph shows a more granular detail of the of LNG trade flows into the region between last year compared to this year. And we can see as a whole, again, coming out of the lockdowns and pandemic, as a whole, the region has grown by 80%. Brazil particularly has grown by over 400%, and that's mainly due to the hydro situation, where there has been very poor rainfall, having a record drought of almost 100 years this year. And in turn, Brazil has had to turn to LNG imports to replace that loss in hydropower generation. Hydropower accounts for 60% of Brazil's power generation. So hence why we've seen that this huge ramp up in LNG imports in Brazil, as they've tried to replace the loss in hydropower with LNG. Also, Argentina is also up this year. Actually, Argentina in previous years had been, the LNG imports into the country had been declining. But since last year, production has been struggling from the Vaca Muerta field. Also, there's been issues of workload issues. There was a strike around the Naque Basin where the field is located. And so Argentina has had to turn into LNG imports to fill that gap in domestic imports. Also, pipeline imports from Bolivia has been lower. And so the Argentina winter season typically happens between May and September. And Argentina has actually, in growing the LNG imports this year, they've actually gone to charter a second FSRU, which arrived here this June. Also, the Tango FLNG project, which was Argentina's only single LNG export project, was cancelled last year, again underlining that decline in domestic gas production within the country. Mexico is also down, and that is basically due to uptick of pipeline imports from the US following the ramp up of the Texas Stop-and Pipeline, which is bringing gas directly from South Texas into Altamira, and that has displaced the LNG imports into the Altamira terminal. And then to drill down and focus on Brazil, and you can see, and this graph shows Brazil's imports of US LNG compared to the rest of the world. And like Brazil has really ramped up LNG imports this year, and most of those cargoes have come from the US, importing a record number of 17 US LNG cargoes in July. And also within the last 3 months, it actually surpassed the likes of China, Japan to be the US largest importer of US LNG, just underlining that much how Brazil is soaking and receiving that many LNG cargoes, but particularly US LNG cargoes, due to its close proximity to the US and the fact that it's able to compete enough with the rest of the world, which I'll also come into later. But also just to mention is the fact that despite those record LNG imports into Brazil, we still saw a kind of a rare move whereby a cargo was exported from Sergipe to Montois, France. And that was probably due to, and I think that was probably at a time when there was sky high prices in October last month in Europe. So the prices must have been attractive enough for Brazil to be able to export this cargo into France, despite Brazil needing all these LNG cargoes. And then this graph shows how the LNG imports sort of matches with the low hydro levels within the country. So it's an inverse hydrological balance showing the deviation from the normal average levels. And so you can see like the peaks of the record low levels of hydro is when we've had the highest number of LNG. And subsequently, when we've had better hydro levels, that's when we have lower levels of LNG imports. And then this just to show, and then what I was touching on earlier, just to show how Brazil has been able to compete with the rest of the global market to attract these cargoes. And so, and to look at the netbacks from Sabine Pass, and netbacks is simply defined as the landed costs minus the landed price minus the voyage costs. And so you can see from around April this year, Brazil has actually offered very good attractive netbacks, and so even better than Europe, and so it's been able to compete and soak away cargoes from Europe. But even at some point around June, July, it was even offering better netbacks than Japan. Again, that's on the back of Brazil being having close proximity to the US, which means less shipping costs. So at the time where prices were quite close between Brazil and Japan, on a netback basis, Brazil was even more attractive simply because of those cheap voyage costs. And that shows you how Brazil has been able to, actually be competitive in attracting these cargoes from Europe and even at times from Asia. And then just to touch on the new demand centers within the region, I will just touch on a few. The Aku terminal, the GNL Aku terminal in Brazil, it received a commissioning cargo and was commissioned in December 2020. But then there were some issues with the startup of it's a gas to power plant of around 3 gigawatts. There was a startup with some issues, and it only became commercially operational last September, this September, and has since then taken three LNG cargoes. All those cargoes, as well as the commissioning cargoes, were supplied by BP. BP has the supply contract for the terminal. Similarly, the Puerto Sandino is also a gas to power, although a bit more smaller. It's around 300 megawatts. And also the terminal, the FSRU in El Salvador, as actually was installed this month after the terminal arrived there from Singapore after retrofitting last month. And to focus on supply. And so US LNG this winter, we expect further growth in terms of exports, largely from Calcasieu Pass and Sabine Pass Train 6. And Venture Global, the project developer for Calcasieu Pass, has already received permission from FERC to bring the first block of trains into service. The Calcasieu Pass is based on a kind of modular technology similar to the Elba plant with 9 individual blocks. We expect the both Calcasieu Pass and Sabine Pass to produce some commissioning cargoes before the end of this year, with commercial operations expected in 2022 again. So this probably is one of the last waves of the exports of the US LNG projects that have come online over the last few years. And also this obviously we saw the huge drop. Just to touch on the huge drop last year, that was mainly due to the cancellations when we had like record low prices last year, which made US LNG cargoes unattractive. With LNG prices so much higher this year, we've had no cancellations, and that has meant the US LNG exports being able to produce at full whack, basically at full capacity. And yes, and US LNG exports is not just swirling into Brazil, it's swirling into the region, like I touched on earlier, with high prices this year. There's been no much cancellations, and so the US LNG exports have ramped up from low levels of last year. Hence why you can see this huge growth of last year compared to this year of 178%, because that was mainly due to that huge drop last year of those US cancellation of those US LNG cargo cancellations. Nonetheless, those exports are driven by Brazil and Argentina, which I've already touched upon. And then Trinidad and Tobago, looking at exports out of Trinidad and Tobago since 2020, Trinidad and Tobago has been declining, and that's been due to dwindling feed gas supplies for the feed gas that supplies the LNG Hello? That's been due to I think I'm hearing an echo. That's quiet. Okay, that's fine now. So that's been largely due to the dwindling feed gas supplies, and several of the infilling drilling projects that were meant to backfill those dwindling feed gas has not yielded any successful results. Even Train 1 was even put offline. But since July of this year, we've seen a gradual recovery of exports after Shell started production from its Barracuda field in the East Coast Marine area. Next is Peru. Peru was also slightly down during the summer months. There was first an outage around May due to some compressor issues. It came back online for a bit, producing only about 3 cargoes, and then went offline again for around 3 months on the back of some reported issues with upstream issues at the Camasi gas field, which is the main gas field that supplies the LNG plant. But since September, seems the issue has been resolved, and LNG exports from Peru have recovered, and they're expected to stay recovered for much of this winter. And I thought people might find this interesting to show new trade routes of LNG cargoes in and out of the region. So last year we saw the first Australian cargo into South America went into Chile, and then only last month we saw a Peruvian cargo into Canada. And it's worth pointing out that most of these both trade routes and both cargoes were shipped by Shell. Shell has offtake in KCLNG and has a supply contract into Chile, and also likewise Shell has the offtake from Peru LNG and supply contract into.
Cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, where last did you hear me? Where last did I stop? Should I just start from the beginning? Okay, I'll just start.
Yeah.
We go on.
No, it's
Yeah.
Okay,
Just what a couple of seconds.
Okay. So it's what, like I said, and then Shell offtake from Peru LNG, and then has a supply contract with Repsol. So we see how, obviously, in a very, very competitive market, Shell is optimizing its positions around the several plants to optimize its portfolio, to stay competitive, and use these new positions and use its positions to create new trade routes and optimize its portfolio. And obviously, also in a time of like high shipping costs, being able to optimize its portfolio, we can see that's what Shell it's doing. And just to recap, obviously Brazil, the main driver of LNG demand in South America and LATAM has been Brazil, with the record number of LNG imports on the back of the low hydro generation in almost a century. Mexican LNG imports is expected to continue to reduce as we see more pipeline imports from the US. LNG imports, obviously, in America reached new record high this year, again, from the huge LNG imports from Brazil, and Argentina. On the supply side, exports from Peru and Trinidad are recovering and are supposed and expected to continue to stay at those levels. Argentina, like I touched on earlier, ceased to be an LNG exporter late last year when the Stango FLNG project was cancelled. And then we see in Mexico, there are some LNG projects that are being planned. One of them currently under construction is the Energía Costa Azul project, which was sanctioned last year. Actually, it was the only project that managed to be sanctioned last year during the low LNG prices because of the pandemic. And it's on the west coast of Mexico, which makes it primed for the Asian markets. It doesn't have to go through the Panama Canal. So I think I've kept to just about time, I believe, or not. And any questions?
Yes, we have some questions regarding Colombia. What happened with Colombia this year? What they are so low level of LNG imports this year?
Yeah, let me quickly go back to. So last year, a huge part of Colombia's, just like Brazil, similarly like Brazil, a huge part of Colombia's power generation comes from hydro, and they actually had a worst drought last year. So they then had to take so many LNG cargoes to replace the loss in hydro power generation. Also, it was quite the fact that LNG prices were at record lows quite last year means Peru could easily turn to those LNG cargoes to the LNG spot market to buy those cargoes. The hydro situation is not as bad as last year, but also again, this year the spot prices are a lot higher. So Colombia would have to really compete with the likes of Brazil and Europe to attract those cargoes. So that's why we've seen that drop in LNG imports compared to last year.
Okay, we had a little bit short of time. We have the chat questions about Peru LNG and the dynamics in Peru, but I think this is a little bit further. There are others related to the prices. Olumide, what do you think about Peruvian cargos linked to the Henry Hub or to oil?
Well,
a tricky question. This is depend, but what is what do you think about this?
Again, I would say, from a long, LNG plants, LNG projects are 20-30 year projects. So you want a guarantee of income, you want stability. The thing about indexing to Henry Hub or any kind of spot market is you are subjected to the volatility of the market. So I would say, as we've seen, prices can really crash and can really rise, especially within the spot because of the dynamics with this. I would say probably link it to oil because that way you're dealing with less volatility, I think. And for a project that is meant to, for a project like LNG plants that are built over 20, 30, 40 years, you kind of want that guarantee of return. You want that stability, to work with, which is why traditionally LNG projects were mostly based on long-term contracts. And, it's only in the margins of the last few years that we've seen spot market really come into play.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olumide, for being here today. I really appreciate your intervention, presentation, fantastic. So without any other further question, I just thank you. I got here, well, we are short of...
I think, sorry, what section? I think is the person asked, I think the person asked me, is the price of Peruvian LNG cargoes linked to Henry Hub or oil?
Yes.
I think actually the price of Peruvian cargoes was linked to supply, price of LNG cargoes into Mexico, and so it was actually linked to Henry Hub. It was actually linked to Henry Hub pricing. So when it was signed, but obviously Shell is the off-taker of the LNG, of the LNG. It was much more economical for Shell to send those cargoes elsewhere. So there's been a renegotiation between Peru LNG and between Mexico and Shell. But that's for another day. But yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We are short of time. But again, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for being here. And now we will continue, Guillermo, with the presentation. So this is the end of the English presentation. I will turn back in Spanish. So muchas gracias. Vamos siguiendo el programa del día de hoy. Guillermo, si me apoyas con las presentaciones.